Story 1, Gone with the Wind. It was in color, and the movie theater charged extra for color instead of black and white. I think this was probably around 1949 or 1950. The story completely went over my head. Instead, I was totally focused on Bonnie Belle and her clothes. She had a pony and saddle that fit her perfectly. I was so jealous, as I only had a full-size saddle on a plodding old horse that was deemed gentle enough for a preschooler. I still remember that feeling of envy. Yes, I completely ignored the fact that she was killed when that pony threw her into a jump bar. Story 2. I'm not sure if it was the first, but it sticks in my mind. In 1975, I was just 7 years old. One of my friends had a birthday party, and the festivities included going to see a movie, Jaws. You have to remember that this was a different time. There was no PG-13 rating, and I lived in Los Angeles, the film capital of the world. I was, however, traumatized for life. Story 3. I was 4 years old when my dad showed me the original Jurassic Park. My young mind was completely amazed. Story 4. Grease, at the drive-in no less, was fabulous. I was 5 at the time, and when I saw the movie during its re-release at age 19, I was blown away by how much my young mind did not understand, and that my parents actually took us. I assume they had no idea of the content. Story 5. I was probably in 4th or 5th grade, and my friend's parents were at work, so we went over to her house and watched it. Story 6. The Rocky Horror Picture Show was on MTV at night in the 1990s when I was about 5 or 6 years old. I didn't have adult supervision because I didn't live with my mom, and my great-grandmother was asleep. I didn't understand everything at the time, but it made me realize that men in feminine makeup and clothing could look quite good. I also developed a lifelong crush on Tim Curry's voice. Later that year, I saw him in Legend and loved him there as well as Darkness. Story 7. Predator. I watched it with my dad when I was 11 or 12. It was a bonding moment, so I watched it with my son when he was the same age. Story 8. I watched the Tim Curry version at a birthday sleepover when I was about 10 years old. I have been nervous around clowns for decades since then. Story 9. Psycho. I was 9 when it came out. We were a little freaked out by the shower scene, but we still mimicked the iconic shrieking music associated with that scene. Story 10. Jeepers Creepers, 2001. I was in 2nd grade at a sleepover with my sister, her best friend, and her younger brother. My sister and her friend were in 4th or 5th grade, and that movie terrified me of the dark. 7-year-old me couldn't handle it afterward, but I made it through the whole movie. Story 11. Not the full movie, but the red rum scene and the twin girls scene from The Shining. I'm still scared of hallways. The first adult movie I watched in its entirety was probably It's a Wonderful Life or White Christmas. Story 12. My parents took me to see Blazing Saddles in theaters when I was 3 years old. The only parts one remember are the scene where a soaped-up man has his shower stall pulled away and the big fight at the end with all the tuxedo-wearing dancers. Story 13. My first thought was Double Jeopardy, but my mom took me to see rated R movies all the time when I was in elementary school. Story 14. Not sure. My parents let me watch rated R movies for a long time, and my friends were always jealous. The first adult movie I can remember seeing in theaters was the first Hangover movie when I was about 9 years old. I had never laughed so hard. Story 15. My grandfather took me to see Revenge of the Nerds when I was 5. He thought it was a comedy. How bad could it be? I believe that was also the last time I went to the movies with him. Story 16. Midnight Cowboy. My mom took me to the theater when I was 10, obviously not realizing it was a very adult movie. We stayed for the entire film, though. Story 17. The Omen. My father walked directly behind me just as the priest was impaled, and he kept walking. Story 18. Total Recall. My dad and uncle thought it would be fine. There were many strange things happening to people's faces in the film. First, he pulls a large tracker out of his nose. Then, the fake woman's head reacts dramatically, pulling back her lips and separating. Later, in his dream, his spacesuit or helmet malfunctions, causing his face to bulge and explode. Eventually, it happens for real, involving him and her. Then there's Quado with his disfigured face, emerging from someone's belly. The movie centered around people with or experiencing disfigured faces. It left a lasting impression on me. Story 19. I went to the drive-in movies with my dad and his date. I was supposed to be asleep in the back seat, but I wasn't, and I got to watch Dirty Harry. Story 20. Star Wars. A New Hope. The big old 1950s Odeon in Woolwich had the seats shaking as the Star Destroyer came into view, and I was hooked. Story 21. The first rated R movie I saw was American Pie when I was about 10 or 11 years old. I should not have seen that at all. Story 22. Spawn is still one of my all-time favorites and is probably the reason for my love of cringeworthy horror movies and my appreciation for strange, chubby clowns. Story 23. We watch Star Trek and Star Wars frequently as a family. I believe they allowed us to watch Stand By Me when I was 4 or 5. I didn't realize until I was older that it was rated R. Story 24. When I was under 10, my parents let me watch Child's Play with them. I have no idea what they were thinking. Did they genuinely believe I would think it was a cartoon? I still have trauma from that doll, and I am scared to walk around my home at night. Story 25. It may not have been the first movie I watched, but my earliest memory is of my dad saying, "Hey, don't tell your mom," while we watched Roadhouse, the original Patrick Swayze masterpiece, when I was around 9 or 10 years old. I witnessed a brutal scene, but my dad made me leave the room for the stripper scene so it balanced out. It remains one of my guilty pleasure movies to this day. Story 26. Titanic. I didn't understand anything until it sank. It is a 3-hour movie. I was so bored. I remember just staring at the floor and the VHS player. Story 27. I was 9 years old when I was taken to see my first R-rated movie in theaters. RoboCop 2. I was terrified at first, but I wanted to impress my friend who had invited me and be a good guest to his family. I thought the violence was cool, but what struck me was the child who died in it who was a semi-antagonist. Before then, I believed children could never die in films. Story 28. I was 5 years old when my parents' babysitter canceled, so they took me with them to the theater to see Jaws. Yes, that's dating me, but it was totally messed up. I don't watch scary movies. At the first sign of tension in a television show, I leave the room. Story 29. Requiem for a Dream explained in simple terms. That movie is the only reason I never tried drugs. The drug abuse resistance education program had nothing on that film when I was a child. Story 30. Cliffhanger. I remember my mom would throw a blanket over my head for scenes she didn't want me to see. However, it was thin, and I could see through it anyway. I just didn't tell her. Story 31. The Lawnmower Man. I vaguely remember being terrified by the Lost Boys because my name is Michael. Story 32. The Shining. I was 4 years old. I also remember watching Humanoids from the Deep at that time. I don't know why my parents allowed me to see them. Story 33. Talladega Nights. My mom thought it was just a racing movie and took me to the theater as a child. She didn't realize that it could be inappropriate. Story 34. The Fast and the Furious, released in 2001, was a film that I remember well. My parents went on vacation, leaving us with a babysitter. I recall that only my older brother, who was 11 at the time, was allowed to go downstairs to watch the movie while I had to stay upstairs in a different room. Shortly after their return, I finally got to watch it. Story 35. Stand and Deliver. I was probably 6 or 7, and the idea that a negative times a negative equals a positive was always stuck in my head. Story 36. It was a double feature at the drive-in with my parents. The films were Norma Ray, starring Sally Field, and The Rose, starring Bette Midler. I was 9 years old. They made me hide in the trunk because the movies were rated R, and I am pretty sure it was also so they wouldn't have to pay for my ticket. Story 37. I watched Austin Powers with my dad, and I guess he was okay with it. Most of the inappropriate content went over my head. Anyway. Story 38. Either Total Recall or Aliens. I can't remember which was first. I was about 6 years old. My grandfather didn't care who was present when watching movies. Story 39. Not necessarily the first, I guess the first with breasts. The sex education scene in Monty Python's The Meaning of Life probably did a better job in under 10 minutes than real sex education did in an hour. My parents bought it for me on DVD in 4th or 5th grade, thinking it was similar to Monty Python and the Holy Grail. Always using protection was something everyone, except the least informed individuals, learned about early on. This was about all my school's sex education curriculum covered, besides advocating for abstinence until marriage. Monty Python taught me about the importance of consent, foreplay, and where to engage in foreplay. When I performed oral sex on my first serious girlfriend, she asked where I learned to do it right. I replied, John Cleese, I think? Besides that scene, the one where the man gets to choose his manner of execution and opts for a mob of topless, well-endowed women chasing him off a cliff taught me that our DVD player had a slow-motion mode. Story 40. Firestarter was my favorite movie when I was 4. My parents did not believe in restricting access to media for me or my brother. Story 41. Butch Cassidy and the Sundance Kid. Patton was released a year later, and my younger brother and I were highly impressed by the swearing. Story 42. I saw Trading Places in the mid to late 1980s. The first naked breasts I ever saw were Jamie Lee Curtis's. Story 43. The Bride of Frankenstein. I was about 5 years old when my dad took me to the cinema to see it while my mother was undergoing major dental work. Story 44. I'm not completely sure, but I believe it was Tombstone that I watched at my dad's house. Later, when I went home, my mom told me we were going to the drive-in movie with my cousin and uncle, and we saw True Lies. I remember my cousin mentioning it was their first R-rated movie. I shrugged and said, I already watched one at my dad's. Also, as a young child in the mid-80s, I remember watching Nightmare on Elm Street. Story 45. Not grown up in the sense of being inappropriate, but because it would be surprising for a child to find it interesting is Julie and Julia. Grown up in the sense of being inappropriate was probably The Hangover. Story 46. The Good, the Bad, and the Ugly. My grandmother let me watch it when she was babysitting. I was about 8 or 9. I didn't really understand the film, but I loved the music and developed a crush on Clint Eastwood. Story 47. I was around 8 or 9 years old, spending the night at a friend's house when he put on Cabin Fever. I felt really guilty about watching it because I was a kid who always followed the rules, but I didn't want to look uncool by asking him to turn it off. Story 48. Not an adult movie per se, but as a young person, I experienced my first erection while watching the movie Weird Science. It was a confusing moment in my life. Story 49. Risky Business was rented by my parents. I'll never know why they let their young children watch it with them. Story 50. The first Star Wars film I can remember is A New Hope. One of the television stations in the UK acquired the rights and aired it during Christmas, although I might be mistaken about that. Story 51. Not a movie, but as a 6 and 7-year-old, I lived watching Dallas and Falcon Crest every Friday evening. The movie must have been Freddy Krueger. Story 52. Basic Instinct. I was 11 years old. My mom had her 40th birthday party, so she and our parents' friends were celebrating while the kids, ranging in age from 8 to 16, watched TV in the basement. We had HBO at the time and Basic Instinct was on. I can distinctly remember it. Story 53. American Graffiti. I was in 4th grade. I remember being shocked when one of the characters said, "What a cool girl." I had heard plenty of swearing in real life, but somehow it blew my mind that they were swearing in a movie. Story 54. I think it may have been Time Cop with Jean-Claude Van Damme. My dad was watching me at home while my mom took my brother somewhere, and he put it on. There were also Under Siege and Total Recall, which I watched at my grandparents' house with my older cousins. I can't remember what came first, but I was only about 9 when the last one came out. They were all on VHS, so it could have been years after their release. Story 55. I don't exactly remember the first one, as I was probably around 3 or 4, but I do remember a couple. I don't have any idea of the names, though, but they left me traumatized. Story 56. It was either The Spy Who Shagged Me or Dumb and Dumber. I am not sure which one I saw first, but they were both personal favorites of mine by the time I graduated kindergarten. Story 57. Amityville Horror 2. My younger sister terrorized us for months, believing the mirror in our room was cracked. Story 58. I was hiding behind my dad's recliner and watched it without him knowing. I didn't move for what felt like 2 hours for fear of him discovering me. Story 59. Empire of the Sun. I was around 7 years old, and it really affected me when the boy that Bale's character has been communicating with on the other side of the camp gets shot. Story 60. Jurassic Park was released when I was 5 years old, and I saw it in theaters. During the intense scene with the velociraptor in the kitchen, I screamed to shoot him. The moment overwhelmed me. Story 61. Fire in the Sky. I was too young to be watching that movie, but I thought it was as cool as it was scary. I still enjoy watching it from time to time. As far as alien abduction movies go, it's pretty high on my list. Story 62. Silence of the Lambs. I was about 5 years old. I only remember it was that movie because it had the butterfly on the cover. Story 63. The Shawshank Redemption. At 11, it was both intense and utterly captivating, even if parts of it went over my head. Story 64. Indiana Jones. Raiders of the Lost Ark was not great for a 5 or 6-year-old. The intense scenes with Nazis had me sleeping under the covers for a long time. Story 65. Bambi and Father Goose, a Cary Grant movie. Story 66. Jerry Maguire. I remember it vividly because I watched it with my mom as a teenager. There is a scene with the line, "Don't ever stop." Story 67. If Monty Python and the Holy Grail is considered a mature movie, then that would be my first choice. Otherwise, it would be Watership Down. My first rated R movie would have been Alien or The Shining. Story 68. Temple of Doom. I remember the first time I saw Kate Capshaw in that backless red dress. I didn't know what attraction was at the tender age of 5, but that put me on a path to discovering it, that I can say for certain. Story 69. I remember being quite disturbed when they shot Human Cop with numerous bullets before transforming him into RoboCop. Story 70. I was 7. My father took us 4 kids to the drive-in. He thought it was a Disney movie. That night, all 6 of us slept on Mom and Dad's king-size bed. Story 71. The Shining. We had a free Cinemax weekend, and they showed rated movies during the day. My mom told me I was not to watch the channel. I did not listen. I couldn't tell my parents why I was having nightmares that night because I didn't want to get in trouble for watching what I wasn't supposed to. 9-year-old me had regrets. Story 72. Aside from watching my uncles, they probably enjoyed the movie Top Gun. My little cousin loved that film, and we would watch it repeatedly to keep him satisfied. Story 73. I used to get free little boy sausages at Woolies by saying, "Hasta la vista. Baby, I'll be back." Story 74. I was 11 and watched Scary Movie. My mom thought the part where the penis comes through the glory hole was a tongue until she watched it again. Story 75. Saving Private Ryan. I quietly sat on the stairs watching, and my parents didn't notice until it was too late. Story 76. Poltergeist. That was the one I remember clearly because it scared me. Now it's one of my favorites. Story 77. My friend was lying right in front of the screen, and when there was a jump scare, he jumped so hard that he accidentally kicked me in the face. Story 78. My parents took my sister and me to see Titanic in theaters twice when I was about 4 or 5 years old. They tried to cover our eyes during the more intense scenes, but I vividly remember watching the ship sink through my dad's fingers. I also recall my mom trying to explain things to me during the movie while I shushed her. When we saw it again with my cousins, my mom gave up on trying to cover my eyes. I remember my cousin yelling, "Yuck," and telling me not to look at the naked lady when that scene came on. The movie itself didn't scare me. It was my dad telling me later at home that the captain went down with his ship and still haunts the Atlantic that gave me nightmares and made me run out of the room whenever My Heart Will Go On started playing for about a year. Story 79. My parents took me to see it because the message was important. I loved the singing and dancing. Story 80. Around 6 or 7, my mom or her boyfriend left an Alice in Wonderland VHS in the VCR. It was, in fact, not that Alice in Wonderland. It was an old adult film. Story 81, 2001, A Space Odyssey. I was 4.5. My parents thought it was important for us to see it. I had no idea what was happening, except there were monkeys, something we would now call a video call, colored lights, and a strange baby. Story 82, Monty Python. We had stairs that wrapped around behind the lounge area with a full view of the TV, but behind the couch so nobody could see us. My sister and I sat on the stairs watching it for ages until we got caught. We were about 4 and 7 years old. Story 83. I was so carefree when I was younger. I saw Jaws at 4 and was afraid a shark would get me on the toilet. I watched Alien around the same time. I recall watching movies like Scream, Halloween, and RoboCop around 9. I didn't seem to understand the nature of the gore or the story of RoboCop until seeing it again later. How I'm not profoundly affected is beyond me. Story 84. I was 13 when a friend and I managed to see the Harad Experiment. We both thought it was gross. Story 85, The Crow. I saw many others, but they were mostly edited for television or I was instructed to look away during certain scenes. Story 86. I was allowed to watch anything that was on Turner Classic Movies. I assume those count as grown-up movies. They were great for a kid, no profanity, no nudity, and no gore. Story 87. The Thing was terrifying. I still remember it to this day. I was about 12 years old when I watched it with my dad. I don't think I've seen it since. Story 88. I lived in California, and everyone around us had a swimming pool. I refused to swim in the pool after dark, even though it was lit. I haven't swum in the ocean since either. I'm even hesitant about swimming in lakes. It ruined swimming for me. Story 89. Nightmare on Elm Street. My dad warned me it was scary, and I said I could handle it, so we watched it together. I was in elementary school. Story 90. The Exorcist at a drive-in unrated version where the crucifix is used, let's say, inappropriately. Parents assumed I would stay asleep. I was 5 years old, way too young to see that, and parts still appear in my nightmares. Story 91. Dressed to Impress. I was in elementary school, but I don't remember which grade. That movie had a significant impact on me. Story 92. My dad took me to see a drive-in double feature of Big Daddy and Austin Powers with his friends when I was 4. Story 93. In 1959, I was 8 years old, at the drive-in with my parents. I was supposed to be asleep in the back seat. Story 94. The Woman in the Red Dress. It was also the first time I saw nudity, even if briefly. However, the video cassette recorders did pause. Story 95. I remember this vividly, and it always amazes me. I went to see the Mel Gibson movie Ransom when it was released with my dad, and I was the one who wanted to see it. I was 8 years old. It was rated R, and I believe it deserved that rating. I often wonder what my dad was thinking while we watched the film, but it's strange that I saw Ransom and Space Jam in theaters in the same year. Story 96. I grew up in a household that loved science fiction. My dear mother took her 14 and 15-year-old kids to see Event Horizon because it is a science fiction film. Story 97. Shenandoah, a Civil War movie, was playing while my dad was sleeping when I was around 6 years old. Nobody told me to go to bed, so I kept watching. There were battle scenes, field hospital scenes, and blood everywhere. Arms, legs, and feet piled up like corkwood. It was a bad idea. Similarly, 7 or 8 years later, during a junior high school assembly movie day, the screening was halted halfway through when a teacher or administrator realized that the psychological thriller Whatever Happened to Baby Jane was not appropriate for kids. Story 98. Death Race 2000, 1975. A friend's very religious mother dropped us off to see it, having no idea it contained graphic violence and nudity. It was the first time I saw a nude female. I became an instant fan. Story 99. Grandparents took me to see Blade, thinking it wouldn't be that bad since I liked Terminator 2 and Alien. However, that first club scene scared me. I was covering my face the entire time. Story 100. People Under the Stairs. I think that's what it's called. It was rated R, a big deal back then. I haven't seen it since, but it seems terrifying now. Story 101. Singing in the Rain. It was wonderful to see my mom, and the movie was fun. It is one of my early memories and a very sweet one. Story 102. I accidentally found my dad's adult Spider-Man movie, and let me tell you, they were not slinging webs. Story 103. Mortal Kombat is in theaters. My parents never let me play the games, but they agreed to take me to the movie. My 8-year-old self danced in the aisles to Techno Syndrome. Story 104. My best friend and I thought we were being edgy and rented I Spit on Your Grave at the age of 13. My dad intercepted us, but we did watch some of it. Interestingly, I saw it again in a Women in Film course in college during a section about the rape revenge subgenre. I'm definitely done with that movie for life. I also recall seeing Steel Magnolias in the theater when I was around 10 years old. I liked it, but I didn't understand all the more adult themes. Story 105. I was sick often, so my mom would drop me off at my grandparents' house. They had about 4 movies. I would watch Grumpy Old Men every time. Story 106. I watched Dark Crystal when I was 5. It was basically a terrifying and freaky movie back then. I mean, a Muppet dies in it. If there were an Oscar award for Best Puppet Death, she would win it. Story 107. I was 12 years old in 1977. My parents wanted to see the latest movie about dancing, so they took my brother and me to see Saturday Night Fever. Story 108. Lord of the Rings at 8. I loved it. My mom was worried it was too much, but I sat through the whole thing. Story 109. My mom didn't care. She was going to watch her horror movies, and I think I was 4 or 5, so I watched it with her. Story 110. My parents were very strict, but I remember watching 21 Jump Street at a friend's sleepover when I was about 13, and I have loved it ever since. They do not make comedies like they used to. Story 111. I sneaked behind the quilt rack in our living room to watch Jaws when I was 4 or 5. I revealed myself when I asked, "Did he get them?" after the shark killed someone. Story 112. The Birds was released in 1963 when I was 4 years old. I never let my mom forget how that movie traumatized me. Story 113. I remember watching Friday the 13th on regular television. It was edited down. They had a marathon around Halloween years ago, and my mom stayed up to watch them with us. It took several years before I realized how edited the movies were for television. Story 114. If we are talking about adult movies, I accidentally asked my mom for Flash Gordon 2. Unfortunately, there was no such thing, but there was a Flesh Gordon 2. Story 115. G.I. Joe: The Rise of Cobra. It really started my love for action movies and the G.I. Joe franchise as a whole. Story 116. Armageddon. I was 8 years old. I wanted to be an astronaut, and then I saw that movie. I immediately decided against it. Story 117. I don't even know. My mom was not a fan of cartoons, and I was constantly watching disaster movies, crime shows, and documentaries as a kid. Story 118. I saw Saw 3 with my cousin, who didn't think that the movie would traumatize me. I couldn't have a good night for about 2 weeks. Story 119. In my mind, it was a drive-in double feature. Day of the Dolphin and Little Big Man. It is a good day to die. Story 120. Jurassic Park was a favorite of mine as a child because I love dinosaurs. My parents thought it would be a children's movie, but after the first scene, they changed their minds. I remember saying, "Are you okay? Are you scared?" To which I replied, "No, I just feel like I need to run." This was my 5-year-old attempt at describing suspense without knowing the word. Story 121. Babyface Nelson, when I was 11 in 1959, went with my friend of the same age. No parents were required back then to see a crime movie about a gangster. Story 122. The Good, the Bad, and The Ugly is my first R-rated movie. When you have to shoot, shoot. Don't talk. Story 123, Broken Arrow. I was 11, and a friend of my parents was going through hard times and staying with us. He took me to the movies without them knowing. I remember thinking it was so cool. I still think fondly of that guy. He was a good person. It's too bad everyone moved on and lost contact. I would enjoy having a beer with him. Story 124. Saturn III was on HBO. My dad was watching it and he didn't know I was two. I was probably 5 or 6 at the time. It scared me, but it was also the first time I saw a pair of breasts, and they were Farrah Fawcett's. That's probably why I remember it so well. I tried watching it again later in life and it was disappointing. I still don't understand how they got that cast to agree to make such a poor film. Story 125. Are we discussing rating or content? I got into horror movies solely because they were the most likely to show nudity, which is not very mature of me. If we are talking about content, I guess it would be Platoon. My dad was into war films and that was the first one we watched together. Story 126. Ben-Hur on TV kind of freaked me out. Leprosy, chariot races with spiked wheels, and people getting their hands cut off made the ancient world seem scary and violent. Story 127. The Godfather. The theater let me in, though I was only 13. The violence was more disturbing to me than the sexual content. Story 128. Gone with the Wind is on the TV. Mom and Dad would take us to any movie that wasn't rated R or X once we were old enough not to squirm or be noisy. The first X-rated film I saw was Zardoz, and one of my older sisters sneaked me in when I was 12. Story 129. The Howling. I was about 3 or 4 years old when my mom was watching it. I stood in the middle of the hallway until she noticed and put me back in my room because it was a horror movie that would scare me, and I wasn't supposed to be walking at the time. I remember it so vividly as if it happened only a couple of years ago. Story 130. Kingsman with my dad. There was a scene at the end that made me feel uncomfortable watching it with my dad sitting behind me. Story 131. Star Wars. The Empire Strikes Back. My parents and I could not sit together, so I had to sit alone in an aisle seat. I was about 10 years old, but that didn't ruin my enjoyment. Story 132. Keys to the Kingdom stars Gregory Peck as a Catholic missionary priest in China. Made around 1946, I remember being shocked as a little boy by how poor the Chinese were. Story 133. When I was 5, my parents wanted to see Patton, but they couldn't get a babysitter, so they took me instead. I think I slept a lot, but I definitely remember seeing the big speech in front of the giant flag. Thanks a bunch for sticking around till the end of the video. Remember to subscribe, and until next time, stay awesome and goodbye.